everybody's favorite gluttonous and directionless adventurer is back for a whole new game. That's right, there is another Ys game for fans to pick up and play through, and let me tell you guys, I have opinions. First though, allow me to share that over the last 5 months, at as quick of a pace as my free time would allow, I have dedicated my Twitch streams to play Ys games in anticipation of this release. That, coupled with a recent playthrough of Kelketa, puts me at 7 Ys games played in the last year, and all with the goal of setting me up for Ys 9 Monstrum Nox. And as we will see, there were both good things as well as bad in taking this approach. For those uninitiated, Ys is the story of an incredibly strong-willed adventurer named Adol Kristen who makes his way from land to land and basically solves other people's catastrophic otherworldly problems. And for the majority of the series, this is literally how the games go. There was Ys Origin, which actually didn't feature Adol at all, but generally speaking, the games revolve around this central character, and the creators are no strangers to this as they like to poke fun at how cliche a game series of this age can become. I don't think at this point I have to restate how much I enjoy this JRPG series, and because of that, I don't need to tell you that I was excited for 9 to be localized. I played it some more for completion purposes, and my verdict is a tough one because, as I said, I have many thoughts, praising as well as criticizing. Firstly, let's start with a brief look at how the Ys games usually work. There's lots of exploring, time spent in dungeons, the games are challenging, you're going to expect to have to refight bosses several times, lots of grinding, and sweet loot for you to pick up, all while you're listening to a jamming metal orchestral soundtrack courtesy of the Falcom sound team. They also almost always revolve around the same character, Mr. Adol Kristen, as I said before, with the exception of Ys Origin. The last new Ys game in the series was Ys 8 back in 2016 or 2017 depending on where you live, and before that we had Ys Kelketa in 2012, and all the way back in 2009 we had Ys 7. As you can see, there is quite a bit of time between the releases, and with each new one, the gameplay becomes a far reach from the series' origins, which dates back to the late 80s. Over the years, Falcom sought to change a few elements and modernize the games a bit, adding and changing things here and there. We weren't doing full reviews of games back when 8 released, but I did play it and overall I enjoyed it. However, I didn't like a lot of aspects about Ys 8 because of the changes. I still mostly feel that way. Now, I bring this up because sometimes we have to expect a bit of change in a series that spans 4 decades. It can be difficult for hardcore fans to embrace, but change is going to be inevitable. Well, this is part of what prevented me from enjoying 8 more than I wanted to, and I think about that a lot when I look back at that one. Well, fast forward to 2021, and I have to say Ys 9 takes the departure from the familiar Ys experience several steps further. In some ways good, and other ways not so good. Without spoiling too much, the basic premise of Ys 9 is that Adol and Dogi, fresh off the heels of their latest adventure, just wandering around, come across the city of Balduq, and immediately Adol gets imprisoned. Then he breaks out of jail, and then in the process of breaking out, he basically becomes Spider-Man. However, he slowly finds out that his powers come with a drawback, you see, as he is required by law to participate in tower defense rituals at the behest of some mysterious half-winged lady. Adol is not alone in this labor because he acquires a ragtag JRPG Scooby gang to fight with. Another drawback is that you can't leave the city because of your powers, and even some sections of the city itself are off limits at the start of this game. Of course, our wandering red-haired adventurer would never stand to be caged up. There are these themed demonic enemies that you can specifically kill, and little by little as we fight them, you do open up some of those barriers and are able to move around more freely. The real story is the mystery of these powers and this mysterious lady and what is going on in the prison city of Balduq. Now let's take a closer look at the game itself. So the Ys challenge, which includes having to refight most of the bosses several times, is largely gone, as is the need for level grinding. I actually felt the need to increase the difficulty early on because of how I was just cruising through the first few areas of the game. Luckily for hardcore fans, there are 3 levels of difficulty past hard, which I with some curiosity will attempt one day. One thing that bugged me was the way the game handles equipment. It's still set up in a similar way to a Ys game, but I swear the first major portion of the game, you are never given any equipment to upgrade. Later on, we get a handful of better pieces of armor and weapons for our characters, but there was a big delay before we got to that point. Again, this is something that the Ys games almost always have. That is, a lot of equipment for your characters to buy and break in, that you progressively explore, and you can also find some of them in chests, etc. Instead, I think they wanted the player to focus more on getting stronger in the tower defense portion of the game, by upgrading your ritual relics as well as the other exploration side goals that the player can spend time completing, such as the map or getting all of the treasure chests or the graffitis, sandbox stuff. They also included the different elixirs that allow you to increase your EXP or even just level up outright. This part pissed me off because it didn't occur to me when I was playing 8. This just is a bad fit for a Ys game, and it takes us further from the level grindy gameplay I was looking for. And at the same time, despite all these elixirs, I never really felt much benefit from them, to be honest. I put everything I got into Adal every single time, but he never ended up being a much higher level than the rest of the cast. From the beginning of the game to the end, they all basically leveled about evenly, despite me dumping constant EXP and level up items into one character exclusively. This, with the change of grinding, made the leveling system and paying attention to experience in general feel very underwhelming for a Ys game. I wouldn't call this the biggest disappointment item-wise, but it definitely wasn't handled well, and that is that treasure chests and boxes in Ys 9 are meaningless, and that was never the case with previous titles. All of the red and blue chests in this game have no business being red or blue chests whatsoever. In general, finding a chest in a Ys game is a great moment. Usually it's a piece of equipment, but it can also be a special item that serves as a tool for you to get through some of the platforming in whatever dungeon you're currently in. It also stops the music and the sound effect, which some people have compared to the Metroid sound effect, but still, the sound effect plays and it's an awesome moment. It's all harmonious. That's different now. Not a single treasure chest in Ys 9 felt like I had gotten something of great value. It was usually money, sometimes food or ingredients, and on occasion something better. It made the act of opening treasures so disappointing. I was even getting money in the final dungeon of the game, which is weird because do I really need money as much anymore with the best equipment from the shops already in my possession in a game that I had to turn up the difficulty to get to the normal levels expected? What possibly could I do with gold I found in a final area of a game? At that point, it would have been awesome to give us the ultimate piece of equipment for the game that you couldn't get from the shops like any other Ys game would do. And the game also had its share of technical issues. There was tons of pop-in, frankly way too much pop-in to the point it was embarrassing really. And not to mention, several times while playing I had encountered slowdown. Again, it was kind of baffling to have this happen. This shouldn't be a problem for a PS4 game at the end of the console lifecycle. These issues didn't ruin the game for me, however, given how solid of an experience Ys 8 was, again from my recollection because I played it about 2 to 3 years ago at this point, they had a great foundation to make a new game from, and it just didn't make any sense. What also didn't make sense was what was causing these problems, because it has to be said, despite how large the map is and how big some of these game areas are in scale, it's supposedly one of the biggest Ys game maps to date, the world is just so barren. And this includes Baldur's City, which at some moments really felt like a ghost town. Even during their festival, when one of the characters remarked, "Wow, it's getting really crowded," and you don't see anything you could remotely call a crowd. So, if the game world is this empty, and there's also not a whole lot of foliage and the textures are relatively basic, why the slowdown in the pop-in? Come to think of it, I remember the few screenshots I saw when this game was revealed seemed kind of empty, and what stood out to me was that there didn't seem to be a whole lot of people around the city, or very much to look at all. It almost seemed like this was more of a beta than an actual game. But I put this worry to the side because I was excited just to get another Ys game. It's unfortunate then that this was never addressed for the final release. It's funny, as much as I was disappointed in Ys 8, moments like this made me wish I was playing that one. I criticized 8 for being dull due to lack of other towns, and it didn't really feel like a Ys game adventure, and sometimes it just felt kind of dull overall. Well, I have to admit, at least in Ys 8, the environments feel a bit more fuller, and you could encounter a lot more enemies in the wild just running around, unlike 9. But at this point, I think I had a miraculous moment as a snobby gamer and Ys purist, because I thought back to how I played 8, that was so forefront in my mind when I was playing this game, and how I was disappointed because I was just looking for a specific experience that wasn't there for me. Maybe I was just being too stodgy, maybe I needed to be more open to change. You know what? I was wrong. I was so wrong. I'm way too picky and stubborn, and I am always looking for a specific thing from games, and damn it, I gotta stop this. On this note, I have some people that I need to apologize to, so without further ado, here goes. I do offer my honest apology to Square Enix for criticizing the changes made in Final Fantasy VII Remix this past year. It was wrong of me to be so close-minded, and most of all, I have a lot to apologize to one man in specific, and that is none other than Tetsuya Nomura. I am so sorry, sir. You are not a hack. You make amazing games, and I look forward to the development of your next Final Fantasy game. Thank you. I realized after playing 7 Ys games, 6 of them back to back, why would I just want to play the same thing again? They're great games, don't get me wrong. If 9 was a lot closer to those games, I would have been eternally more happy, but this unique position that led up to me playing this shiny new entry gave me a bit of change of heart. Guys, change can be good, and there is a lot of good things in here. I could see that when I pulled back my fanboy goggles and opened my eyes. For instance, the tower defense style gameplay that was introduced in 8 is much more tolerable and actually built into the quest story, so they give you a good reason to care about it. So I didn't hate it as much and actually look forward to the next one because it meant that we would be going forward with the story and finding out what happens next.
Impressive.
They also really improved cutscene framing from previous titles. In 8 and a bit in Calcutta, I really felt cutscenes were stagnant with little movement on the camera. You can't really have that in a modern story-focused game anymore because it just feels like somebody left the camera on a tripod and things happened in front of it. Where I felt 8 wasn't too graceful about this, 9 had a lot of great pans and zooms and just kind of motion with the camera that was a lot more pleasing and interesting to look at, and it overall made the cutscenes much better. Remember, this is an old series where many of the games told their stories from a top-down perspective at a distance, and you had to do a lot of reading text to get to the events as they unfolded, as opposed to seeing all of the action in real time. So we've come a far way from that origin, and it still needs improvement, but I would comfortably say that Ys 9 did a good job taking the cutscenes in a Ys game to the modern realm, making this a strong candidate as a JRPG. Oh yeah, and platforming is amazing! The characters have gifts, which give them powers, and it makes the gameplay a lot like Saints Row 4, where you are basically a superhero. And it gives a genuine fun satisfaction to scale all the buildings and mountains and stuff. I don't expect this to return for a future game because these powers are centered around the story, but man did I enjoy it. This was a good attempt at going outside the box for a new game. Using the gifts that the main party unlocks, you can run up walls and float across long distances, amongst other things. One thing though, my favorite character, Renegade's ability, I felt like we barely needed. Dolls too. They were cool and definitely useful in dungeons, but outside of that, you didn't need them as much as the aforementioned. It makes sense though, flying and running up walls, you really don't do much more from there, maybe teleporting? And speaking of dungeons, these were the best parts of the game. They didn't have all the bells and whistles of a Ys dungeon I've come to expect, and they were a lot shorter in most cases. But still, they were incredibly enjoyable and once again, easily best part of the game. Ys 9 includes sandbox exploration elements, primarily in the city, and the beginning is a bit slow-paced. So I was starting to fear that they had drastically overhauled what this game would be. Well, let me tell you, there was nothing sweeter in this game than getting to that first dungeon. I didn't want to leave. I ran back and got all the collectibles just because I was finally getting closer to the Ys that I was looking for. Adding to that, it was in the dungeons I realized that the combat is insanely smooth, despite whatever was going on in the parts of the game where we had slowdown, like in the Colosseum. During actual combat, everything gets hyper smooth and very visually pleasing to look at. It's smooth, it's fast-paced, it's really fun. The systems with the flash guard and the flash move are really easy to pull off in this because of how smooth the game looks. Although some of the Nox fights were such a total mayhem of flashing and particles that there were moments where it was hard to tell what was happening, the bottom line is, when this game lets you play it, the action and the exploration, and let's not forget, that mixed with the platforming, goes above and beyond. Oh, and how could I forget, the game continues the trend of Ys soundtracks somehow getting better and better. All the songs here fit perfectly within the Ys history of amazing OSTs, with a few surprises thrown in here and there. There was one track I dug so much, which had a nice lo-fi trap music vibe to it. This is totally out of the mold for this series, and I absolutely love it. It kind of reminds me of the very melancholy, soothing cave theme in 8, but if my buddy Swuasage did his magic on it, that's the Banana Man if you don't know. The last few modern games have been stepping away from a linear adventure to include more focus on map exploration, giving you more things to do with sandbox elements. More and more of this change really shows in Ys 9, because there were times that I couldn't help but notice the game feels like I'm playing Assassin's Creed or Batman Arkham Asylum or something like that. It was a bit of a drag at first, I have to admit, because I don't have time for collectathons these days, and also this kind of gameplay pushes a bigger focus on side questing, and side quest taking a bigger focus is a detriment to JRPGs, especially Ys, in my opinion. I like how linear some of the previous Ys games were, and the introduction of side quests turns me off as a fan. But again, I started to look at this game a little different. And you know what? Because of my time spent with this game and the awesome platforming, I actually quite enjoyed having more things to do. A sandbox game was the last thing I thought I'd even be open to, given how little free time I have now, but by God, Ys 9 did it for me. The last major aspect of this game that I want to talk about is the story. There is a lot of story in this game. I mean, a lot. A good amount of it is voiced, which is nice, and they included the option to let you scroll through voiced and unvoiced dialogue sections automatically. I like the convenience, but it just feels like I'm watching a movie. They obviously had a story they wanted to tell, and they definitely got their money's worth out of their writers, let me tell you. But this could become quite taxing in a video game. I was able to tolerate it because as a Ys fan, the story does do a good amount of servicing, both in feeling familiar and referencing previous games. But non-fans, I think, could be put off just by the amount of dialogue and the amount of text scrolling. The thing is, what's actually going on is pretty cool. The turmoil that ensues in the prison city of Balduc is quite enchanting. However, again, the pace drops dramatically when you start getting hit with long story sections, especially right before the final chapter. And what magnifies this is that the dungeons are super short and there's only a handful of them. Because level grinding is different, it just feels less substantial. The equipment isn't as important, and etc. So, having watered down the Ys gameplay, there isn't too much to fill out the parts in between all of this overflowing amounts of story. It's at this point I can't help but think back to one of my favorite YouTube video essays, kind of like this is a tiny video essay, about a little game called Metal Gear Solid 4. Now, Ys 9 doesn't approach MGS4 levels of too much cutscenes, but it does feel eerily similar. When I got to a dungeon or a new area to explore, I was thrilled, I was ready to go. But then the gameplay parts are usually so short-lived and you go right back to more story. They also prevent you from advancing in some parts until you check off all of the story elements. This is the worst in the hideout bar that the main party sets up. The game just says, nope, you can't go out and play and do fun stuff. You gotta go talk to people for a bit, and it's usually a good like 10 minutes of a hold. If they just gave us more gameplay and a reason to grind and hunt for materials and equipment, it would justify the amount of story. Just like MGS4, at this ratio of gameplay to cutscenes, the gameplay starts to feel obligatory. And it's such a shame because what's here is so freaking good. I will take hours of cliche anime cutscenes if you just give me more of this game to play. And again, the story was good. I liked it. I just wanted to play it more than I wanted to watch it more. Which leads me to have to come up with some kind of verdict. What could that be, you ask? Change is good. It wasn't until I opened myself up to a different kind of game, a more changed, modernized Ys game, that I could really enjoy it. I wouldn't have ever liked this game if I was just hoping for a Ys game the same way I always play them. Because this isn't a good Ys game, in my opinion. 8 was a little bit of a stretch, but 9 is just too far removed from the formula for me to hold it in high regard next to all the other ones as a fan. As a gamer, in general, and as a JRPG fan, I think Ys 9 is still a strong title. The gameplay is good, the soundtrack is amazing, and the story is good, albeit wordy. There are some other drawbacks, but overall, it's not a bad game. If it wasn't for playing 7 Ys games in such a short span of time, I think I wouldn't have been as open to playing something a little bit different, or rather, a lot bit different. Did I want it to be more like a Ys game I like? Absolutely. But they subverted my expectations, and a lot of what's here resonates strongly with my love of action RPGs and sandboxes and anime and goofiness. So Ys 9 is every bit of fun as a Tales game or a Dragon Quest game or any other neat JRPG you can play right now, even though it might not be the strongest entry in a long-lasting series that I love so much. Finally, I would like to take a moment and throw it back to late 2017 on this channel when we did our Game of the Year video. For that year, my GOTY pick came down to either Ys 8 or Persona 5, which both released that year and were great choices. I handed the win to Persona because, again, like I said before, 8 just wasn't to my liking as a Ys fan. I had expected so much from it, and here's what I had to say. Overall, I love the game, but I come away a little bit underwhelmed for this, but hopeful that if we do get a Ys 9, this game would serve as an excellent starting point to create an even better overall experience. In response to that, I think they did an incredible job at giving us a good foundation that led to the creation of an amazing piece of video game history, that is Ys 9. It was still different, I still didn't get the ultimate Ys experience that I wanted, but overall, it's a great game. They tried something new and it worked really well, quite possibly could become my Game of the Year for 2021, and most of all, I'm excited that this series is still alive and well, and I'm happy to support it. And it's all thanks to the groundwork they laid out when they made Ys 8 the way they made it. Now, maybe next time Falcom can make another old school isometric Ys with chibi-sized characters and lots of dungeon crawling and level grinding, sort of like Ys Origin, which was the last one in that style. Maybe that could appease the desire for a more classic experience. Only time will tell, as the story always continues. And that is the quick scope for today, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. Once again, I didn't think I would have any difficulty giving this game high regard, but unfortunately there were some hiccups, and it was also a lot different than I was expecting, which made it hard to kind of review, but I did the best that I could here for you today. We would appreciate if you guys gave us any feedback in the comments section below. Also, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and we will see you on the next TooStupidGamerz video. Thank you guys, and we'll see you next time.